Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger from the Schiller Institute. Welcome to our webcast with our founder and chairman, Helga Zepp LaRouche. It's July 15th, 2020. There have been a number of very interesting developments that indicate the potential for a dramatic shift in the strategic situation. One of these is the commutation of the Senate of the sentencing of Roger Stone by Donald Trump, which set off a wave of hysteria among the crowd that's responsible for the regime change coup. Roger had a very interesting interview with Sean Hannity a couple nights ago on Fox. Helga, what was your sense from watching what Roger had to say?
Well, I think it is very explosive because obviously Roger Stone was able to elaborate in this interview with Hannity that the entire basis of his case could have been proven to be non-existent by the judge in his case allowing William Binney and Ray McGovern to testify, which he had requested, because they have the evidence, the forensic evidence, that there never was a hacking of the DNC computers, and therefore the entire basis of Russiagate is not existent. So therefore, all the many people who are now howling and are upset about the commutation of this sentence, they are actually quite afraid about the implication of all of that, because this will now come out that it was a coup attempt, that it was a British coup with the collusion, not of Russia, but between the intelligence apparatus of the Obama administration and a foreign government, namely the British government. And as President Trump just said, the case of Christopher Steele is actually one of the keys to blow this whole thing up, and he should be extradited to the United States and be put on trial in the US for treason. Now, this is really something everybody should support, because if you want to have truth, historical truth, then that is the most fruitful thing which can happen. So I'm actually appealing to all of you to support this idea. Now, there was also a very interesting and very fascinating article by John Solomon, who actually looked at the documents of the fine which was given to Christopher Steele by a British High Court, in the case of the unjust accusations against Russians, which led to a fine. I think Christopher Steele has to pay £20,000 or something like that. But more interesting than that is that Solomon basically said that looking through the documents of that case, which was conducted in London, there is now court evidence that Christopher Steele actually worked and has testified that his final client for this dodgy dossier, which is full of lies, was actually Hillary Clinton, that he worked with the FBI, that the FBI withheld evidence in many cases, but especially in a criminal way, withheld evidence to the FISA court. And that all is now available as court material. So this will be a very, very interesting question, because it will provide the evidence that there never was a Russiagate, or rather never was a Russian collusion, and that the whole Russiagate was and is part of an ongoing coup against President Trump. So I think this is really fascinating. It opens up a whole new dimension of the political situation, because once the culprits actually come to their to justice, a lot of these people should go into jail, not only Christopher Steele, but many of the people involved. And this is the reason why the hysteria about Roger Stone is so gigantic right now.
Yesterday, Helga, you put out an assessment that we are now at a point where we're moving toward a P5, that is Permanent 5 UN Security Council membership summit, that there's motion towards that. How important is the revelations coming out on the whole Russiagate? What role does that play in opening up the potential for this summit to take place?
Well, as we have said many times, the hysteria against President Trump from actually long before he even was a Republican presidential candidate was because the British establishment and the transatlantic establishment, they were completely worried that Trump's intention to improve the relationship, especially with Russia, would actually come into reality. And that the entire Russiagate coup was designed to prevent Trump and Putin from ever meeting. Actually, it took a very long time before the two presidents met for the first time at the G20 meeting in Hamburg, much longer than it normally would have taken between the leaders of the United States and Russia. And when they had this very successful summit finally in Helsinki, all hell broke loose. And this whole hysteria was orchestrated to make sure that there would be no possibility for Trump to fulfill his intention to improve the relationship with Russia. Now, with this Russiagate exploding in this way, just when the efforts by President Putin rather, which he started in January, when he made this proposal for the first time. In the meantime, very concrete proposals, what should be the agenda of such a summit, have been handed to the other four members of the permanent UN Security Council, permanent members of the UN Security Council. And there was a discussion on the telephone between Pompeo and Lavrov, where not very much came out. They discussed hotspots like Syria, Libya, Afghanistan, but also other issues. And Putin, in his article about the Second World War, at the end of this article, he had said very clearly that the aim of this P5 summit is to learn the lessons of why it happened, that it came to World War II, namely that there was no security architecture which would have prevented it. And that this summit was also extremely important to address the urgent need to overcome the economic crisis, which has been aggravated by the corona pandemic. So we know that it's on Putin's mind to solve these two essential problems. So even if it was not published in the Pompeo-Lavrov meeting, one can assume that that is a centerpiece of the whole discussion. And as our viewers and readers and listeners may know, the Schiller Institute has conducted now 3 international conferences starting in April, then May, then June, where we tried to suggest certain absolutely necessary subjects for such a summit, namely the need to have a new Bretton Woods exactly in the intention of Franklin D. Roosevelt, and as my late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, has been campaigning for his entire life, one can say, or the last 50 years. And that, obviously there must be a completely new paradigm in the international relations, because we are sitting on a strategic powder keg. And only if you elevate the discussion to the level of the presidents and the leaders of state, that you can actually have the undisturbed atmosphere, which normally is being poisoned by the permanent bureaucracies, which has all kinds of molds in it, which always try to work to prevent such a progress from happening. So I think there is an actual potential that we can have a new system, but this is now planned for September, and we have now July. So we should not be sitting on our laurels, but we should all really be absolutely working to make such a summit succeed, because this may be the very last chance of humanity to avoid a catastrophe. So while it is very hopeful, there is no room for complacency. And I'm really asking all of you to support the success of such a summit by discussing the issues which need to be resolved.
You mentioned that Pompeo and Lavrov talked about hotspots such as Afghanistan, Syria, and Libya, but we see another very real hotspot taking place now in the South China Sea. What's going on there, and why has this become, again, such an important friction point between the US and China?
Well, there is very clearly, an effort to contain Russia, to encircle Russia. These are the NATO moves towards the border of Russia closer and closer, the maneuvers, but also the whole discussion to extend NATO globally into the Indo-Pacific. And as part of this, the not so peaceful parts of the Trump administration are actually, creating all kinds of, almost incidents by having many sorties of US planes near the Chinese coast, also having warship deployments in the South China Sea. And the recent move was an effort by the State Department to revive the whole conflict between China and the other uh, countries of that region, which had come to a trial on the basis of a suit of the old previous government of the Philippines in Den Haag some years ago. And basically, the State Department said that they side with the claims of all of these other countries who challenge that the islands and shoals and reefs are all part of the Chinese territory. Now, in a certain sense, this is really a very backward approach, because after this Den Haag ruling some years ago, all the countries of the region had agreed that it was not the proper way to go unilaterally to the Den Haag court, but that there is a code of conduct, that all conflicts can be resolved through diplomacy and through negotiation, and that therefore there was no need to have this kind of unilateral trial going on. So in a certain sense, this was settled. And, also the whole dynamic of the Belt and Road Initiative, the economic cooperation in the region, had set a completely different tone already. But China reacted very strongly against that, and said this is actually worsening the situation very much. And also, in respect to Hong Kong, because first you had the Senate, basically threatening Hong Kong with the withdrawal of the special status. And now President Trump signed the Hong Kong Autonomy Act, which basically takes away the special status of Hong Kong. Now, China is now reacting in a tit-for-tat way. This is also a new tone of escalation. They say this Hong Kong Act is an absolutely unacceptable interference into the internal affairs of China. And they will now impose sanctions against certain senators and institutions in the United States, Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, and others. And I think this is, really a very bad thing, because as we have discussed many times, the relations among the two largest economies in the world is so absolutely crucial for the solution of any problem. And it is very bad. Wang Yi, the foreign minister of China, said that the relationship between the United States and China is horrible. Peskov, the spokesman of the foreign ministry of Russia, said the relationship between the United States and Russia is almost rock bottom. So, that's why we push this summit as really the best and maybe last chance to completely overcome these hotspots. Because if you look at the totality as a whole, also in light of the article which was written by President Putin on the origins and prehistory of World War II, and if you think how the prehistory of World War I actually evolved for 30 years after the ouster of Bismarck, then the whole, Balkan Wars, the Russo-Japanese War, where you can actually say that the chess game was totally rigged. And when the shots of Sarajevo happened, it was just the trigger. And we are now in a situation where, with these encirclements of Russia and China, the the chessboard is actually set. And, that's why people who really know the strategic situation and see how all the disarmament treaties and other treaties were dismantled in the recent period, that we are in a period of utmost strategic instability, that you can compare it to the situation before World War One. What is lacking is the shot of Sarajevo, which could happen any time in the form of an accident or some other provocation of some sort. So the need to go into a new paradigm is so super urgent, and that is what we should really understand.
An interesting move in that direction is one of these other hotspots, namely Iran, which is a target by the neocons, people like John Bolton, but also the British especially. But the Chinese and the Iranians have signed what looks like a very promising deal. Is this partly what you're talking about with the idea of a move to a new paradigm?
Yes, this is in preparation also for several years. When President Xi went to three countries of the region in 2016, to Iran, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia, he agreed with these countries on long-term cooperation. So there are now these rumors, I don't think it's totally confirmed yet, that there will be a 25-year oil for technology deal between China and Iran, whereby China will invest in many projects in Iran, infrastructure, related things, for a discount price of oil from Iran to China for 25 years. Now, that is very useful and exactly the kind of oil for technology deals my husband always advertised. And this was also what was discussed between China and Iraq already in September last year. Now, this is part of a whole package. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, the CPEC, is another aspect of that. And obviously, there is still the recent development of a major deal between China and Lebanon, which is on the verge of bankruptcy and social uproar because of the terrible economic situation. Now, there are similar options. Obviously, Afghanistan and Syria are still war zones. So, despite the fact that China has declared the intention that it would have similar deals with these countries, and Syria clearly has expressed hope for this to come into being. Also, Afghanistan has the previous government and the present government have expressed many times that they think and hope that Afghanistan will be a nodal point of the Belt and Road Initiative for the entire region. So the framework is there, and the best thing would be if the United States and the Europeans would, really just say the problems in these places is so big, they are so big. Why not join hands and cooperate in the reconstruction of Southwest Asia? We have to make good for the endless wars which destroyed this region for 20 years, caused millions of people to die. And Trump has promised many times to end the endless wars. So hopefully this can be put on the agenda, and the refugee crisis could be solved this way, and at least for that part of the world. And I think that is something, we should really have a reset and stop geopolitics, stop being in the footsteps of the grand chess game of Brzezinski and the British grand game for, more than 100 years. So that is, I think, a promising sign, but it needs to have support from the rest of the world.
And Helga, you said that one of the things the summit should take up is the escalating economic crisis. These strategic provocations are driven in some way by the systemic collapse of the financial and economic system. We just had these reports of the growth of debt, the danger of waves of bankruptcies, waves of foreclosures, evictions, and defaults. Where do things stand in your view on the economy right now?
Well, the only reason why there has not yet been a blowout of the system was because of these incredible bailout programs by all the central banks, the Federal Reserve, the ECB, Bank of England, Bank of Japan. They have literally poured trillions of money for the maintenance of this banking system. But there is now many reports from some economic institutes like the Boston Consulting Group, like the Halle Leibniz Institute for Economic Research, who are warning that in the aftermath of the coronavirus pandemic, the lockdown, the short work program, which still is affecting many, many small and medium firms, that there is the threat of a mass wave of bankruptcies in the coming months, and that will be a threat to hundreds of savings and loans banks in Germany. But if you look at the other countries, Germany by far is not the only country. Other countries in Europe are even in a much worse situation. So this is why we are absolutely insisting that you need the full package, Glass-Steagall. You need a end to the casino economy, and you need a credit system, the new Bretton Woods system, new credits, and restart the real economy. With our program for 1.5 billion new productive jobs, 50 million in the United States, 50 million in Europe, and a real industrialization program in the so-called developing countries, which are not so developing right now. So I think that is very urgent to be pushed on the agenda, and we need public support. So again, my appeal to you, become active with us.
Helga, another thing that you've been talking about that some people are still not willing to accept is that we seem to be heading toward a much worse situation with the corona pandemic than most people are willing to admit. There's a push to open the schools in the United States as well as around the world, and yet we're seeing record levels of new infections every single day in states like Texas, California, and Florida. What's your sense of where things stand on this right now?
Well, I think, I mean, anybody who watches the situation, I have a hard time to even imagine how people still can somehow say this pandemic is just a flu or an invention of Bill Gates. I mean, we are watching all the international media from Africa, from Latin America, from India, from Russia, from China. And in order to assume that this is all just a made up story and a plot, that it's just not true. I mean, the reasons for this pandemic are clearly the suppression of development in the developing countries for 50, 60, 70 years by the IMF and the World Bank, which have created the condition that many of these countries are now completely defenseless against this onslaught of the pandemic, a locust plague, famine, which is killing every 10 seconds a child of hunger. People who are not willing to really study the totality of this, I really appeal to review this. Now, the situation in some African countries is horrendous. People who are, in the so-called informal economy, they just don't have the means. I mean, it's really the danger that these people will perish, as Beasley from the World Food Programme has said many times. India, you have a similar situation. Latin America, Chile, Ecuador, Brazil. In the United States, you had calming down in places like Maryland. Now it's spiking again. Also, California, Florida, Texas have clear surges. Now, some governors react one way, like Governor Newsom of California. He just reintroduced closing of gyms, of bars, restaurants, sport places, and so forth. While in Florida, they reopen Walt Disney at a point when the figures go up quite significantly. So this is, in a certain sense, very, very unfortunate, because also in Germany, for example, which did relatively well by having strict measures, now these people are all going to the beaches in Mallorca, and you had these incredible scenes where people are all of a sudden dropping all precautions. They don't wear masks. They sit very closely together, and naturally, this will lead to new spikes. And the other people who don't do this get quite angry and said, "Why did we take all these hardships?" With the close down, many people are in danger of going bankrupt or losing their job, or have lost their job already. And some people just don't care because they want to pursue their hedonistic impulses. And I think this is just increasing the social tensions in a major way. Now, in the United States, obviously, this debate to reopen the schools is also, causing some major concern. On the one side, it is very clear that the children need to be schooled. It's bad for their development to, have online education only. The many parents, have to work, so they have an urgent reason to want to send their children to school. But it's also clear that many of the teacher associations and parent organizations are very concerned about their safety, and I think that has to be addressed. It is right to open the schools, but it has to be done under the right conditions, which means you have to invest quite a bit of money in improving the infrastructure of the schools. Many of the schools are old. They are, they don't have warm water. They have all kinds of other problems. So you need a clear plan discussed with health scientists, that the number of pupils in a room has to be reduced so that you can have social distancing. If the space is not sufficient, maybe you have to construct pavilions in the side by in the yard of the school, or wherever you can do it close by. You have to have testing of everybody, of the pupils, of the teachers, of the personnel, the staff. Then you have to have all the other equipment. For example, the experience with putting plexiglass among the different participants, the pupils, having hand sanitizers. There is a way of doing it, but you have to invest, and that obviously is only possible if you invest in infrastructure big time, as we have defined it. So if you go for the 1.5 billion infrastructure job creation program, then you can solve it. But it has to be part of that approach, because if you just reopen the schools, it is an invitation for disaster, and the consequences of this could be quite horrible down the way. So I think it's one more reason why you need to have an absolutely different approach. Not the banking system has to be protected, but the physical economy has to be rebuilt. And then also the opening of the schools can be managed in that context.
And Helga, we're running out of time, but I'd like to get your response to something that just occurred in the last couple of days. President Trump had a meeting to discuss violence in the cities, and he made a statement which drew a typical reaction from his opponents, that it was over the top, when he said that American cities are less safe than the situation in Afghanistan. What's your response to how people react to something like that?
Well, it is unfortunately the reality. I mean, the figures of police shootings, of attacks on the police, the whole question of the statues. I mean, we have seen in the recent period an increase in the, shootings in the major cities of 3-digit numbers. So really an explosion. So Trump made these remarks in the context of meeting with some people who wanted to thank the police that they saved their life or the life of their children. And there is actually also on a community level a real effort by the police to try to reconstitute trust between themselves and the population. So obviously this discussion is extremely important. But I think President Trump is absolutely right when he says that the situation in many cities in the United States is worse than in the war zones like Afghanistan. And that also is one more reason why you need to have a real reconstruction of the economy. You have to have a health system for every country in the entire world. And, we have to go for building bridges. All parts of the society have to be brought together in a harmony of interest, in a coincidence of opposite working together. Because, it's not just inside the United States, in the cities, but also among nations on the world. We are sitting on the verge of an abyss, and we have to establish a higher level of reason of working together. But that requires to build a completely new system, a new paradigm. And that is the subject of our efforts, which I again ask you to join.
And I would urge people to go to the Schiller Institute website and look at these 3 10-minute videos from the last Schiller Institute conference, which took up some of the themes that you've been discussing today. So Helga, thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you again next week.
Yes, till next week.